Let's start with step 1, where we are going to use Spring Initializer to create the base setup for our application. When we create a project with Spring Initializer, we would need to give it a group and an artifact ID. The group ID I'm giving it is com in 28 minutes Spring Boot. The artifact ID I'm giving it is student services. Next, we will choose our dependencies. You can type the dependencies you would want to add in the drop down. I would want a web, so I would want the starter web, so that's why I typed in web, and you can see web is added in here. Spring Boot Starter Web is a great starter project for developing web applications as well as RESTful web services. We would also want to add in a couple of interesting ones. Actuator, ACTUATOR. We will use dev tools as well. Actuator allows us to monitor our application in production. So I can find out if a specific service is up or down and what kind of responses I'm getting back from specific service. All that I can find out using Actuator. DevTools is also an awesome thing. It helps me to find out, it helps me in while I develop applications. So if I make a small change, I don't need to restart the entire embedded server. All that I would need to do is make the change, and the DevTools would be making sure that the application is reloaded. You can go ahead and click Generate Project. You can download this and extract to a folder, probably something on a folder structure which says C:/Spring Boot, or if you are on Mac, extract it to some folder where you'd be able to access it. Download the zip and extract it to a folder. You can open up your favorite IDE. We are using Eclipse, and I would do a file, import existing Maven projects, and type in the directory where you copied the project to. So I downloaded and extracted it to this folder. So I've extracted it to a Spring Initializer project for copy. So that's the folder I extracted it to. So whichever folder you have extracted your zip file to, that's what you would need to give in here. Once you do that, you would see this specific project coming up. So all that you need to do now is just click finish. This might take some time for you because if this is the first time you are initializing this project, then it would take a long time to initialize everything. Once the entire thing is loaded up, you would see four important files. Student service application, you'd see application.properties, you'd see student services applications tests.java, and Pom.xml. Let's try and look at each of these files in detail. One of the things you should have already noticed is the fact that there are a lot of dependencies which came into our Maven dependencies. So you'd see that we have actually not done anything, but we have a lot of dependencies which are already in our Maven dependencies. Spring Boot related stuff, there is Spring related stuff, there is Tomcat related stuff, logging related stuff, binding, and also other stuff which is related to unit testing. So all that kind of stuff is already in our class path. Isn't it awesome? That's all the magic of Spring Initializer combined with Spring Boot. We have a small article on Spring Initializer on our website springbootutorial.com, and we are going to use that article to review our stuff. So basically, Spring Initializer is a great tool to bootstrap your Spring Boot projects. It allows you to create varied range of projects, web applications, RESTful applications, batch applications, among a lot of others. And it supports varied range of starters. The starter that we made use of is Spring Boot Starter Web. There are other starters as well. Spring Boot Starter Web Services to develop SOAP web services. Spring Boot Starter JDBC if you want to do JDBC. I mean, it's old time, but if you still want to use JDBC, you have the option available. And you have Spring Boot Starter Security. We will look at all these stuff in other videos of this particular series. This is the exact structure of the project we have right now, correct? So we have a student service application, application.properties, student services application tests, and a Pom.xml. The Pom.xml is the place where you define all your Maven dependencies, your Maven plugins, and things like that. If you're not an expert at Maven, one of the things which we already have on our website is a reference to all the important things. So if you don't know Spring or Spring MVC, or you don't know Eclipse or Maven or JUnit or Mockito, then we have references. These are 1-hour video courses on all the popular frameworks. Most of these video courses are very popular and have more than 100,000 views. I'm sure you would find them useful. Let's get back to the Pom.xml. There are three important things that are configured in the current Pom.xml. So we generated a project using Spring Initializr. So the Pom.xml contains a reference to a parent. So it contains a reference to Spring Boot startup parent. What does Spring Boot startup parent contain? We'll look at it. And other than that, the one important thing is the Java version. So the default Java version is which Spring Boot, which this specific version of Spring Boot uses is 1.6. We want to override that, so we are saying I want to use Java version 1.8. The other things that the POM contains are the dependencies. So we chose actuator, we chose web, and we choose DevTools. So all these dependencies are added into the Pom.xml. The Spring Boot starter test is added into all the projects because irrespective of whichever application you're trying to create, you'd want to write tests, right? Unit tests, integration tests, and all that kind of stuff. The last thing which is present in here is Spring Boot Maven plugin. The Spring Boot Maven plugin will help you to run the application as well as create jars and vars. So we'll look at a couple of these things which are in the Pom.xml. The first one is Spring Boot's parent Pom. So the Spring Boot parent Pom is right here, right at the top, almost at the top. There's a parent, so that's the Spring Boot parent Pom. Let's first try and understand what Spring Boot parent Pom contains. So all Spring Boot projects typically use Spring Boot startup parent as the parent in the Pom.xml. This is what we saw, right? The parent and the link to it. So what does the parent Pom allow us to do? Typically in Maven terminology, parent Poms allow us to manage, kind of generically put things together for child projects. So a Maven project might contain multiple modules. So for all those modules, all the common configuration is put into the parent Pom. So some configuration, Java dependencies, and Java version and other properties. You have dependency management as well. Which version of dependency to use? And if you want to exclude certain things, then you can put that in here as well. So dependency management is common across all the modules. And default plugins. So Surefire plugin, or how do you run your unit tests? How do you run your integration tests? And the plugins to do that. You will have all the common configuration in your parent Pom. So specific to Spring Boot startup parent, what is in it? So if you look at Spring Boot startup parent, if you open up the Pom, then you would see that it has another parent. It's Spring Boot dependencies. So project extends Spring Boot startup parent, Spring Boot startup parent extends Spring Boot dependencies. This is kind of inheritance hierarchy, right? So if you open up Spring Boot dependencies, you'd see a few things. We'll talk about them a little later. For now, one of the things you'd see other than the Spring Boot dependencies parent in the Spring Boot parent Pom is the fact that the default Java version is 1.6. So you'd see Java version 1.6 which is configured there. So that's the default. We overrode that in our Pom by making it 1.8. That's cool too. And the other things that the Spring Boot startup parent specifies are a host of plugins. So you'd see a lot of plugins which are in there. So failsafe plugin, you have jar plugin, you have Surefire plugin, and other stuff. So that's basically the thing. So we have the Spring Boot dependencies as the parent. We have the few properties specifying Java version and other things, and we have the default plugins defined in the Spring Boot startup parent. What does Spring Boot startup parent inherit from Spring Boot dependencies? We saw that Spring Boot dependencies is at the top of the Spring Boot startup parent, right? So we saw that at the parent, Spring Boot startup parent, the parent of Spring Boot startup parent is Spring Boot dependencies. So what do I really inherit from there? So what we inherit from there is the default dependency management for all projects. So basically, Spring Boot dependencies specifies the versions of all the dependencies. So starting from ActiveMQ, EHCache, all the Spring related stuff, all the Spring Boot related stuff, Jackson, you have Velocity, Undertow, Tomcat. So all the versions. So when I use a specific version of Spring Boot, what version of a specific framework I would use? So when I'm using the current version of Spring Boot, which we created the project with, we would by default get 5.0.9 final version of Hibernate. We would get 5.2.4 final version of Hibernate Validator. All these things are defined in the Spring Boot dependencies. To summarize the whole thing, basically what we get from Spring Boot startup parent is A, dependency management, and B, plugins other than the Java version. So those are the things we are getting from Spring Boot startup parent. Let's move on to Spring Boot starter web. What are we getting from Spring Boot starter web? Spring Boot Starter Web is something called a Spring Boot Startup project. So there are many projects like Spring Boot Starter Web. Why do we need Spring Boot Startup projects? One of the things is with, let's say I want to develop a web application. This is an extract from our Spring MVC course, which was before Spring Boot. So I had to add in all these dependencies in Spring Web MVC, Jackson Data Bind, Hibernate Validator, Log4j, and a few other things as well. Not just that, I also had to auto-wire them in. So I had to say, okay, this is the way you need to configure your views resolver. This is the way you need to configure your properties. Hey, this is how I want to configure dispatcher servlet. And let's say I was using JPA, then I would need to initialize a data source. Then I would need to do initialize a entity manager, transaction manager, and a lot of other stuff. Starters are a set of convenient dependency descriptors that you can include in your application. So all that you need to do is include the starter, you'd get the dependencies and the configuration for free. All these dependencies you get for free, and all this configuration you get for free. So you don't need to worry about it. So all that Spring Boot would provide you. So the example starter project that we would use is Spring Boot Starter Web. That's the one which we are using right now to develop our application. So Spring Boot Starter Web. So it really brings in two important features. One is compatible dependencies that we need to develop web applications, and the second one is auto configuration. So how did we get Spring Boot Starter Parent into our Pom.xml? If you open up the Pom.xml in the project that we have, which we just imported into Eclipse, you'd see that Spring Boot Starter Web is in the Pom.xml for that. So open up the Pom.xml, go to the last tab, and you'd see Spring Boot Starter Web in here. So this is how we add the dependency for Spring Boot Starter Web. We created it to Spring Initializr, so Spring Initializr added it in for us. Once we added in Spring Boot Starter Web, we saw that we got a lot of dependencies. So what kind of dependencies did we get? All the Spring Boot related ones, logging related stuff, the Tomcat, embedded Tomcat. We'll talk about embedded Tomcat a little later. We get the validation stuff, we get the data binding stuff, and the base core Spring framework. So all this we get by just adding these lines. So we don't need to add individual dependencies anymore. So if I use Spring Boot Starter Web, I don't need to worry about adding in all these stuff. So these things, I can forget about them. I don't need to care about them, because once I add in Spring Boot Starter Web, I get all of them for free. Same thing. So if you launch our web application right now, so if I go ahead and say, how do I run this application? Do I need to install Tomcat? Do I need to install the server? Nope. All that I need to do is right click, run as Java application. Right click, student services application, run as Java application. That's all you need to do. Nothing else. If you wait for a little while, the server would start up. There you see, the server has started up as well. So where is Tomcat coming in from? So I'm getting in Tomcat because I added in Spring Boot Starter Web. Do I have Tomcat installed on my local machine? No. The way I'm getting Tomcat is something called an embedded Tomcat. Tomcat is also part of our application. It's in our Maven dependencies. So right now, there is no difference between Tomcat and Spring Framework. We are getting Spring Framework as a dependency. We are getting Tomcat as a dependency as well. So that's the concept of embedded server. So the server is embedded into your application. It is no different from any of the other jar that I'm making use of. So I'm making use of logging jar. Similarly, I'm making use of Tomcat. So you don't need to really go and, when I'm deploying this application, I don't need to go and install it somewhere. That's the cool thing about embedded servers. Okay. One of the things you would see in the log, if you looked at carefully, is all these mappings. So you would see mapping servlet, dispatcher servlet to this, mapping /error to this, mapping web jars to this. So who's doing this configuration? I have not done any configuration in our application. So in the application, all that we have is 4 simple files. But where is all this stuff coming from? So you'd see that there is a mapped /error to something. There is a mapped a lot of URLs to something. There is a dispatcher servlet mapping somewhere in here. Let's search for it. Dispatcher. There is this mapping for dispatcher servlet. Have I configured a dispatcher servlet? Nope. I have not configured a dispatcher servlet at all. Who configured it for me? That's where the magic of Spring Boot auto configuration comes into picture. So basically, if you look at it at a high level, Spring Boot Starter Web or any Starter for that matter would get us is two things. A, dependencies. So Spring Boot Starter Web is to develop a web application. So all the things that you need to develop a web application, you'd get them directly as a dependency. The second thing is auto configuration. Auto configuration is basically, I don't need to say create me a dispatcher servlet, create me an error page, add me the WebJar functionality. I don't need to do that at all. All that gets automatically created for me. That's the magic of auto configuration. If you're interested in knowing more about Spring Boot Starter projects or Spring Boot Starter Parent, Spring Boot Starter Web, or auto configuration, I recommend you to visit our website www.springbootutorial.com or do our 6-hour course on Spring Boot. We have multiple courses on Spring Boot, so those would help you to become an expert at all the things which happen inside Spring Boot. Let's go ahead and now continue with building our application in step 2. In 28 minutes, our focus is on making you an expert at Spring Boot. We have created a complete website on Spring Boot at www.springbootutorial.com. The link in the description of video would take you to a page where you find details of all the courses, videos, and the articles we have created on Spring Boot. If you love our videos, you'd love our courses too. Our courses have great reviews on Udemy. You can see some of the reviews in here. And there are also articles on basics of Spring Boot, auto configuration, starter projects, starter parent, REST services, web application. All the code examples, we have Maven projects which are present, which you can directly import into Eclipse and start running them, and other references as well. This page would be a great start for you to become an expert on Spring Boot. You might also want to visit our website www.in28minutes.com, all other courses other than Spring Boot as well. Thank you for all the support you are providing us. We would not have grown to 52,000 on Udemy. We would not have such great reviews on courses on Udemy without your support. We would not have been able to grow to 28,000 subscribers and more than 3 million views without your support. We want you to learn and make best use of all the courses that we have. Good luck, and I will see you in the next video or the course. Until next time, here's Ranga from In 28 Minutes signing off.